Chapter 21:14. The guards standing on the side were all frightened. They were afraid that if they were unhappy, they would be eaten by the wolf snake. You two, who is the elder brother and who is the younger brother? Sitting in the carriage, Muyu asked happily. My name is Xiao Xin, I am the elder brother. Xiao Xin raised his small head and proudly replied. Looking at his appearance, it seemed like he wanted to act like he was the older brother. Oh! You are little potato. Then you are little watermelon. Muyu suddenly raised his eyebrows and turned to look at Xiao Zian. After Xiao Zian heard Muyu's words, her face suddenly turned ugly. My name is Xiao Zian. The way he said his name in such a serious manner was too similar to Xiao Chen's. Muyu was very happy and laughed. Looking at Xiao Zian, he inexplicably felt like he was looking at a miniature version of Xiao Chen. His eyes were full of smiles. Sitting in the carriage, he happily chatted with the two little guys. The carriage smoothly entered Peng City after the sky was completely dark. The city was brightly lit. When Muyu appeared in front of Jingyu and Xiao Chen with the two little guys, Jingyu was completely confused. Jingyu, long time no see. Muyu looked at Jingyu with burning eyes and greeted her. He automatically ignored Xiao Chen who was standing on the side. Why are you here? Jingyu looked at Muyu and was speechless. She widened her eyes and asked, Why is my son with you? Mother. Xiao Xin happily rushed into Jingyu's arms. The way he rubbed against Jingyu made Xiao Chen feel disgusted. He stretched out his hand and pulled Xiao Xin away. He looked at Xiao Xin seriously and said, How did this king teach you? Father. Xiao Xin was pulled away by Xiao Chen. He suddenly lowered his head and silently complained in his heart. Father is so bad, ha ha ha. Muyu on the side laughed heartily and said, This young master was traveling around. I didn't expect to meet these two little guys on the road to rob me. I know they are your children, so I brought them here. Rob? Rob what? Jingyu's eyes widened as she asked in surprise. That. Muyu turned around and pointed outside the restaurant. A shiny golden carriage stopped at the entrance. It was so dazzling that it almost blinded Jingyu's eyes. Jingyu looked at Muyu and her mouth twitched. Only Muyu would bring such a flashy carriage. Was he not afraid of being robbed? Oh, no. Now, she had been robbed by her son. Let's go inside and sit. Jingyu listened to Xiao Xin excitedly say that the carriage was given by Uncle Mu. Then, along the way, Uncle Mu talked about some interesting things. She also learned that Uncle Mu almost became her father and so on. Jingyu was still smiling when she heard the first part. But when she heard the last part, she suddenly felt the temperature of the surrounding air drop sharply. Jingyu's facial muscles also stiffened. She turned her head and looked at Muyu who was getting more and more frightened. Muyu didn't expect that Xiao Xin would say all the things he said. Listening to these words, Muyu felt a strong sense of hopelessness. That. Ninth Emperors, this is definitely a misunderstanding. I absolutely don't have the slightest intention of coveting the ninth imperial concubine. Muyu quickly explained. Chapter 21:15. However, the gloomy expression on Xiao Chen's face did not dissipate at all after he heard the explanation. I really didn't. Even if I did in the past, I definitely don't have it now. Muyu said again. The corners of Xing San and Xing Lu's mouths twitched when they heard this. How could he explain it like that? In the past. In the past, wasn't the ninth imperial concubine not married to you yet? As the saying goes, everyone loves beauty. Jingyu is so beautiful, Muyu said it so seriously that he did not notice that Xiao Chen was clenching his fists bit by bit. It felt like his wife was being peeped at. It was incomparably unpleasant. Xiao Chen looked up at Muyu and waved his hand indifferently, Take him away. Yes. Xing San and Xing Shiwu could not stand it anymore. After they received Xiao Chen's order, They immediately stepped forward and took Mu Yu away without saying anything. Hey! 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 I haven't finished speaking yet. Where are you taking me? After Mu Yu was taken away, Xiao Chen and Jing Yu suddenly felt that the world was peaceful again. Xiao Chen's expression gradually improved. Dad, Mom, where is Uncle Mu going? The two little guys who were eating happily on the soft couch asked curiously. Oh. Your Uncle Mu is sick. Sixth uncle is taking him to see a doctor. Jing Yu smiled at Xiao Xin and Xiao Zian. Uncle Mu said something wrong and Dad got angry, so he was taken away. Xiao Zian swallowed the food in her mouth silently and said seriously. Jing Yu's mouth twitched when she heard Xiao Zian's words. Hey! Xiao Zian was stunned when he heard these two answers. Cough cough. Let's eat. Jing Yu decisively chose to shut her mouth and reached out to pick up food for the two children. Xiao Zian was a complete replica of Xiao Chen. It was fine if she didn't speak, but when she did, it was like a lightning bolt. Jing Yu felt an incomparable sense of worry. The two little guys wanted to sleep with Jing Yu and Xiao Chen, but the possessive Xiao Chen threw them into another room. Then, he closed the door and went to sleep with Jing Yu in his arms. I don't have to give away my wife. That's great. Jing Yu was completely speechless at Xiao Chen's actions, but her protests were completely ineffective. Fortunately, the two little guys were very well behaved and didn't make any noise. The two little guys were sleeping soundly on one side. Early in the morning, Jing Yu and Xiao Chen were still sleeping when they heard the sound of the door opening. Then, two little figures climbed into Jing Yu and Xiao Chen's bed. Daddy, Mommy. The two little guys didn't say anything and crawled into Jing Yu and Xiao Chen's quilt. Xiao Chen had to let go of Jing Yu. Looking at the two little guys crawling into the quilt, he slightly frowned. Jing Yu looked like she was still half asleep. Why are you up so early? Jing Yu patted Xiao Zian's head and planted a kiss on Xiao Zian's white and tender cheek. Then, she looked at the two little guys and asked. After being kissed by Jing Yu, Xiao Zian was immediately satisfied and crawled into Jing Yu's arms. Xiao Chen frowned and reached out to pull Xiao Zian out. Before Xiao Zian could feel his mother's soft body, he was caught by Xiao Chen's big hand. Suddenly, he lowered his head and looked up at Xiao Chen. The father and son looked at each other and sparks flew everywhere. Chapter 21:16. When Jing Yu saw this scene, her eyes were full of smiles. She helplessly said, "What are you guys doing?" Xiao Chen and Xiao Zian silently looked at each other and continued to look at each other without saying a word. In the end, Xiao Zian seemed like she didn't want to look anymore. She yawned and closed her eyes. Then, she buried her head in Xiao Chen's arms. Although Xiao Chen had a look of disgust, he still reached out and covered himself with the quilt. Did you sleep well last night? Jing Yu calmly asked as she pinched Xiao Zian's little face. Not good. The bed here is too hard. Xiao Zian's face was full of disgust as he unhappily said, the bed here is not as soft as the one in the carriage that Uncle Mu gave me. Oh. Jing Yu suddenly chuckled. Mu Yu really knew how to enjoy life. The family of four rolled around on the bed for a long time. After talking for a while, Jing Yu and Xiao Chen helped the two little guys get dressed. While Mu Yu was anxiously waiting for him, he finally arrived. You guys are finally up. This young master's teapot is almost empty. Mu Yu looked at Jing Yu and Xiao Chen with hidden bitterness and said. Isn't it better to drink until you're full? Jing Yu rolled her eyes indifferently. She watched as Xiao Chen carried the two children to a chair. Then, she slowly sat down and looked at Mu Yu and asked, why did you come here instead of staying in the northern pastoral? Only you guys are allowed to go sightseeing, but I'm not allowed to go out. Mu Yu said with disgust, looking at you guys getting married and having children, this young master is still alone. This time, I came out to bring a beauty back to get married. Ah! Jing Yu frowned and asked curiously, I remember. Aren't your wives and concubines in the Mu Palace? Nonsense. When Mu Yu heard Jing Yu's words, he suddenly jumped up and angrily said, "Those women were forced on me by others. I have no other intentions towards them. The one I'm looking for must be a woman that I love deeply." Jing Yu looked at Mu Yu's serious appearance and the corner of her mouth slightly twitched. Looking at Mu Yu's appearance, Jing Yu was really worried about Mu Yu's trip. But this guy actually found a Tokyo in the northern pastoral. "I see that you guys are going to the Roman forest." Mu Yu changed the topic and asked as he looked at Jing Yu and Xiao Chen. "That's right." Jing Yu nodded slowly and said, "Now that there's nothing to do, I want to go to the Roman forest to play. Maybe I'll stay in the forest for a long time. Yin Xian and Yin Feng's children can take advantage of this opportunity to raise them well." TSK. Mu Yu was speechless when he heard Jing Yu's words. Only Jing Yu would bring her children to the forest, and only Xiao Chen would allow Jing Yu to do as she pleased. However, there didn't seem to be any harm in the forest. Thinking about how Jing Yu came out of the forest and was already so powerful, these two children definitely wouldn't be too bad. Just as Jing Yu and Mu Yu were talking, Third Xing suddenly rushed in. His strange expression immediately attracted the attention of Jing Yu and Xiao Chen. Xiao Chen looked at Third Xing and asked, "What happened?" Chapter 21:17. "Master, we just received news from the Crown Prince of the Imperial City." Third Xing said quietly, "The Crown Prince has written a memorial to remove the 9th Emperors from his position and take over the imperial residence. The Emperor has decreed him to be Prince Qingping. In addition, the Crown Prince has broken up the entire Xing alliance and rebuilt it. We have been abandoned." Third Xing was on the verge of tears when he said this. He had only come out with his master once, yet he had been abandoned. He didn't even have an organization anymore. "What did you just say?" "The Crown Prince has written a memorial to remove the 9th Emperors from his position." Mu Yu was shocked when he heard this. He looked at Third Xing and Xiao Chen in horror. The son had removed the father from his position. Most importantly, the emperor had agreed and even decreed him to be Prince Qingping. Mu Yu felt as if his worldview had been refreshed. He looked at Xiao Chen, wanting to see Xiao Chen's expression. Unfortunately, Xiao Chen's face was completely calm. He didn't have any other emotions. Brother Crown Prince has become Prince Qingping. Is he a very powerful official? Xiao Xin, who was on the side, asked excitedly. Yes, your brother Crown Prince is now an official with a higher rank than father. Jing Yu's eyes were full of smiles. Her gloating expression made Xiao Chen unhappy. He cursed in his heart. This traitorous brat, madam, there's one more thing. Third Xing calmed himself down and said, the Crown Prince has bought all the businesses under madam's name. He's using madam's son's name. Now, all of madam's businesses are under the Crown Prince's name. The novel that madam wanted to publish has also been taken over by the Crown Prince. In other words, madam has nothing now. After Third Xing said this, Jing Yu felt as if she had been struck by lightning. What did you say? Jing Yu almost jumped up. Those businesses were all Jing Yu's assets. It would be fine if they were gone, but the novel was copied and printed. It was the story of Jing Yu and Xiao Chen. Jing Yu had asked someone to write it for nearly a year. It was currently selling like hotcakes. She didn't expect it to be taken away by Xiao Bai in the blink of an eye. At this moment, Jing Yu's heart was filled with a huge fuck. Third Xing's words of having nothing immediately provoked Jing Yu. What did Xiao Bai say? When Xiao Chen heard that Jing Yu's property was also taken away, he immediately felt much better. Others might not know, but Xiao Chen knew that that money was Jing Yu's life. Xiao Bai's torment had definitely taken away half of Jing Yu's life. The Crown Prince said that inheriting his father's position would allow him to do things better. With enough money, he would be able to walk more smoothly in the official circles. The Crown Prince also said that Master and Madam don't have to go back. the prince's mansion, has been demolished and rebuilt. There's no place for master and madam to stay. After Third Xing said this, Mu Yu was completely dumbfounded. He turned to look at Jing Yu and Xiao Chen, who were equally dumbfounded. He couldn't help but laugh out loud, ha ha ha. You guys will have such a day too. Ha ha ha. You've been tricked by your own son. Ha ha ha. Mu Yu's wild laughter successfully made Jing Yu and Xiao Chen turn around. Chapter 21:18. Are you laughing? Jing Yu gritted her teeth as she stared at Mu Yu. Ha ha ha. I really can't help it. Look at you, the 9th emperors and the imperial concubine with different pupils, were actually tricked by their own sons. Now, not only are they penniless, they can't even go home. Ha ha ha. Jing Yu listened to Mu Yu's words. She suddenly felt the muscles on her face twitching fiercely. She took a deep breath and said, "Drag him away." Mu Yu was dragged away while laughing wildly. Jing Yu confirmed with Third Xing again and again, and finally found out that Xiao Bai really didn't leave any leeway. He was telling Jing Yu and Xiao Chen not to go back to the Tokyo. Xiao Bai has really grown up. Jing Yu sat at the table and said with a sigh. That's good. Xiao Chen leaned back slightly and said calmly, with Xiao Bai in the Tokyo, it seems like there's nothing for us to do. You can rest assured now, right? I still feel uncomfortable. When I first found him on the island, he didn't know anything. Jing Yu let out a deep sigh. There was a faint nostalgia in her eyes. Unknowingly, so many years had already passed. That little child from back then had now grown into an adult. I've already said that Xiao Bai is very suitable. Xiao Chen reached out and held Jing Yu's hand and said calmly. Jing Yu smiled helplessly, but she also felt relieved. After Jing Yu and Xiao Chen packed up, they prepared to leave. The carriage that the two little brats stole from Mu Yu, there was no reason for them to return it. In addition, Jing Yu and Xiao Chen were poor. The carriage had to be left behind, so Mu Yu was robbed. Jing Yu and Xiao Chen took the two children and left. On the way to the Roman forest, Jing Yu slightly lifted the curtain of the carriage and looked at the distant city behind her. There was a faint sadness in her eyes, but when she felt Xiao Xin snuggling into her arms, his cute appearance made Jing Yu's mouth blossom with a smile again. Isn't this what Jing Yu has always wanted? To be able to leave the hustle and bustle of the city, Jing Yu had too many concerns. Now, Xiao Bai directly cut off Jing Yu's escape route, and also told Jing Yu and Xiao Chen that they can do what they want to do without worry. How could Jing Yu not understand Xiao Bai's meaning? Everything seemed to be the same in the Roman forest. However, the outer perimeter of the forest had been baptized by the flames of war. Even after such a long time, one could still see some traces of it. When Jing Yu entered the forest, she immediately sold off the golden horse carriage and exchanged it for a lot of silver notes. Only then did he feel a little more confident. Nothing changed in the depths of the forest, but the grass and leaves became more lush. Jing Yu stood under the tree and reached out her hand to touch the trunk of the big tree. The corner of her mouth revealed a faint smile. The joy that came from inside made Jing Yu feel comfortable. Father, is this the place where mother used to live? Why is there no house? Xiao Xin looked at the lush trees and the small body sitting on the silver arrow. He looked around with some doubts. Because mother is waiting for little potato to build the house. Jing Yu turned her head and looked at Xiao Xin with a smile and said, let's build the house on the tree, okay? Chapter 21:19. Wow! A house on a tree. Good, good. Xiao Xin suddenly jumped up and down in excitement. Xiao Xian's face was also filled with excitement. Jing Yu and Xiao Chen looked at the happy faces of Xiao Xin and Xiao Xian, and their eyes were filled with smiles. Within the Roman forest, it seemed that with the arrival of Jing Yu and Xiao Chen, it became noisy. In the depths of the forest, pleasant laughter could often be heard. Jing Yu said that it was not fun to wear a sparrow. Jing Yu really built a house on a tree. Jing Yu liked the big tree very much. On the tree trunk, there were several houses built. These were the residences of Jingyu and Xiao Chen. 3rd Xing, 6th Xing, and the others were all chased away by Xiao Chen and Jingyu. Of course, they were only chased away after the houses were built. There were 3 small houses. Jingyu and Xiao Chen's house was on the largest tree trunk. Xiao Xin and Xiao Zian's house was next to each other, but they were separated. These 2 little guys seriously said that they wanted to live separately. Jingyu and Xiao Chen were naturally happy to see this. The forest was silent. As the gray wolves leaped, time seemed to pass little by little. Throughout the year, there was always the person you loved by your side. Everything seemed so perfect. On a long slope, Jingyu wore a very simple dress. She walked up step by step with light steps. When she looked up, she could see 3 pine trees standing proudly on the top of the mountain. "Yuer!" A call came from behind. "Mother, wait for us." Jingyu's footsteps paused. When she turned around, she saw 2 gray wolves rushing up. After circling around Jingyu, they quickly ran to the top of the mountain. Xiao Chen, dressed in black, walked towards Jingyu unhurriedly. Xiao Xin and Xiao Zian also trotted towards Jingyu with their short legs. "Slow down." Jingyu looked helplessly at the 2 children who were covered in dirt from playing. The tenderness in her eyes could not disappear. Xiao Chen came forward and held Jingyu's hand. Then, the 2 of them walked towards the top of the hill. The 2 children were followed by 4 wolf pups. They ran happily to the top of the mountain. On the top of the mountain, there were 3 tombstones. The names on the tombstones were Jingyu's parents, Jingyu, and his wife, Qiyun. The last one was the tomb of the she-wolf who saved Jingyu. There were no weeds on the 3 tombstones. It could be seen that Jingyu and Xiao Chen often came here to take care of the tombstones. Jingyu took Xiao Chen and the 2 children and respectfully bowed in front of the tombstones. Then, she sat down under a pine tree and looked up at the sky and trees in the distance. The corners of her mouth curved slightly. The she-wolf likes to look from here. Now that she has her parents with her, she won't be lonely. Jingyu slightly lowered her eyes and looked up at Xiao Chen. She said, "Do you blame me for dragging you to live in the deep mountains? What nonsense are you talking about?" Xiao Chen frowned in dissatisfaction. He hugged Jingyu and said deeply, "With you by my side for the rest of my life, even if I have to live in hell, I will still be very happy." "Fool." When Jingyu heard Xiao Chen's words, she suddenly smiled. Her eyes were filled with deep affection. She looked at the mountain forest in the distance and suddenly felt a little absent-minded. When did she and Xiao Chen meet? Chapter 21-20. Daddy, Mommy. Did you meet each other here? How did you meet each other? Xiao Xin was tired from playing with the wolf pups. He happily got into the arms of Jingyu and Xiao Chen and asked curiously while blinking his eyes. "Us?" When Jingyu heard Xiao Xin's question, she was slightly stunned. Then, she absent-mindedly said, "That was a long time ago. At that time, your mommy was only 14 years old." Jingyu's gaze was very distant. She looked at the mountains in the distance and thought of the first time she met Xiao Chen. She took Yin Xian out to hunt, but she didn't expect to meet Xiao Chen. Originally, she thought it was just a fleeting moment, but she didn't expect to get herself into big trouble. When they first met, they were hunted down in the whole city. Then, she felt embarrassed when she fell into Xiao Chen's bath. Finally, he protected her again and again in the imperial city. Jingyu never knew that a person could penetrate into her life little by little. From then on, it was unforgettable. At first, it didn't matter. Later, Xiao Chen protected her again and again. He fought against the emperor and the imperial concubines. It was as if he always tolerated her. "Xiao Chen, when did you fall in love with me?" Jingyu seemed to be in a trance as she asked. "When I first met you, it was probably deep in my bones." Xiao Chen's answer was deep and distant. That kind of amazement didn't come from the eyes, but from the heart. Jingyu suddenly smiled. Since they met in the imperial city, when she looked for her father and learned the truth, she hesitated and hesitated. How did she fall in love with him in the end? She thought more than once that she didn't belong to this world. How could she be worthy of love? Later, she thought about why she didn't look at the present and only thought about the future. Now, Jingyu only rejoiced in her heart. Fortunately, the man she accepted was so outstanding. Since they were in love, twists and turns and quarrels were inevitable. Now that she thought about it, she felt that everything she had experienced back then was actually so wonderful. When Tokyo was discovered, this man continued to protect her without hesitation. He did not care about his reputation and protected her wholeheartedly. He allowed her to do whatever she wanted. Even though Tokyo was the city he had protected wholeheartedly, he did not hesitate to abandon it. Because that person was her. Jingyu was so lucky to have Xiao Chen by her side. Mother, is this love? Xiao Xin and Xiao Zian listened to Jingyu's long-winded story. It was as if they had heard it many times, but no matter how many times they listened to it, it was still vivid and moving. Yes, it's love. Jingyu reached out and stroked the heads of the two little guys. Does father love mother? Xiao Xin turned to look at Xiao Chen and asked. Love. Xiao Chen turned to look at Jingyu and said, deep love without regrets. Then, does mother love father? When Xiao Xin heard Xiao Chen's answer, he immediately nodded with satisfaction. Once again, he turned his gaze to Jingyu. Xiao Chen also looked at Jingyu, waiting for her answer. This. Jingyu frowned and said, this question, I need to think about it carefully. Jingyu. Xiao Chen looked at Jingyu and suddenly gnashed his teeth. Jingyu exclaimed and quickly ran away. She laughed and said, if you catch me, I will tell you the answer, ha ha ha. Xiao Chen looked at Jingyu who ran away and helplessly lowered his head. In the end, he unconsciously smiled, stood up and chased after Jingyu. The two little guys shouted for their father to chase after them, and then shouted for their mother to run away. Amidst the laughter and the sound of the wind, Jingyu quietly looked at Xiao Chen with her pair of golden green eyes. She said she loved him very much. End of story. Chapter 21-21. The Tokyo had grown stronger and the northern pastoral had maintained its status quo. Nothing seemed to have changed, but was there really no change behind this tranquility? No one knew. Perhaps Xiao Yuling knew, but didn't do anything about it. Xiao Yuling had once said that the world was only interesting when one competed with others. Now, in Xiao Yuling's opinion, it was meaningless, right? The world was still the world. Even after experiencing the destruction of a country, it didn't change the original state of the world. Everything in the northern pastoral was very quiet. After Helian Theo became the emperor of the northern pastoral, the status quo had always been maintained. In the northern pastoral imperial palace, Helian Theo sat on a wide dragon throne. He raised his hand and rubbed his forehead tiredly. Your Majesty, it's getting late. You should rest early. The head eunuch standing by the side looked at Helian Theo and said with a frown. Okay. Helian Theo raised his head. On his handsome face, there was a stubble on his chin. His originally beautiful face seemed to have a lot more charm. His fox-like eyes still carried an invisible charm. Helian Theo slowly stood up and said, I heard that the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine of the Tokyo Imperial City have left the Tokyo Imperial City. Crown Prince Xiaobai has been conferred the title of Prince Qingping. Helian Theo asked casually as he walked towards the sleeping quarters. Yes, the 9th emperors is no longer in charge of the Prince Qingping residence. The head eunuch said respectfully. You do have some ability. Helian Theo smiled faintly. He turned his gaze away and didn't say anything else. Looking at the buildings and roads in the northern pastoral imperial palace, he suddenly felt a heavy fatigue. There's no need to come in and serve me. Helian Xiao turned his head and spoke very indifferently as he stepped into his bedchamber. That eunuch bowed in acknowledgement and watched as Helian Xiao walked into his bedchamber. However, the words that were at the tip of his tongue didn't leave his mouth. The emperor had been back for so many years. There were countless beauties in the harem, but the emperor had never summoned any of them. The position of the empress had always been empty. In the past, the head eunuch would ask about it from time to time. But there was no result. Now that he saw the emperor's appearance, he was incomparably anxious. The head eunuch let out a long sigh, if there was something wrong with the emperor or not. Of course, Helion Shou didn't know that the head eunuch by his side actually held this kind of thought. Presumably, if he knew, he'd definitely chop this damned eunuch in a matter of minutes. He actually suspected that there was a problem with his own ability. Inside the sleeping quarters, Helion Theo reached out to undo his outer robe. Just as he was about to take it off, his arms suddenly stiffened. A cold expression flashed across his face. He slowly turned around and saw the tall figure standing under the beaded curtain enter Helion Theo's line of sight. You! Helion Theo's eyes widened little by little. He looked at the familiar figure walking over with heavy footsteps. The expression on his face cracked a little. He called out in astonishment, "Feng Maching." "It's me." Feng Maching was wearing a dark purple robe. He was tall and his black hair was casually tied up. Chapter 21-22. Feng Maching looked at Helion Theo with a deep and serene gaze. The stillness in his eyes caused Helion Theo's heart to skip a beat. "What are you doing here?" Helion Theo turned his head away uncomfortably and said, "You. What are you doing here? This is the Northern Pastoral Palace. If you're caught, even 10 heads won't be enough for you to be beheaded." Helion Theo silently took a deep breath and suppressed the uncontrollable emotions in his heart. After so many years, she originally thought that those feelings would settle down little by little with time. However, she didn't expect that those feelings that she thought had settled down would collapse the moment this person appeared. "With you around, would you be willing to let me die?" Feng Maching looked at Helion Theo's expression and suddenly smiled. The corners of his mouth curled into a faint smile. The gaze he looked at Helion Theo with was scorching and deep, causing Helion Theo's heart to tremble violently. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Helion Theo forced himself to calm down and clenched his fists slightly. "It's been 5 years, Helion Theo." Feng Maching walked towards Helion Theo step by step and said, "I've traveled thousands of miles and seen the fickleness of the world. I've restrained myself from rushing back to look for you countless times. However, all of these, the moment I heard the slightest bit of news about you, I came without hesitation. I came here today to ask you only one question." Feng Maching stood in front of Helion Theo. The two of them were only a step apart. Feng Maching quietly looked at Helion Theo and said, "Tell me, in these 5 years, you haven't doted on a single concubine, haven't touched a single person, and why is the position of the Empress empty?" "You? How could you?" After hearing Feng Maching's words, Helion Theo's eyes suddenly widened. Then, as if he had thought of something, he gritted his teeth and said, "You asked the people from the Constellation Palace to investigate me." "And, that's right." Feng Maching shrugged casually and said, "I did investigate you. How could Su Yu and Xing Yi agree to such a rude request?" Helion Theo was so angry that the roots of his teeth itched. After saying this, he suddenly froze and abruptly raised his head to look at Feng Maching. Looking at Feng Maching's calm and serious gaze, he suddenly had a bad premonition. "Oh, I'm just speaking the truth." Feng Maching's lips curled into a faint smile. Helion Theo's face stiffened for a moment, then looked at Feng Maching coldly and said, "You bastard! What did I do?" Feng Maching said very innocently, "I just asked Su Yu about the Northern Pastoral Emperor. She said that Jing Yu wanted to know. Can't I say that?" Feng Maching slightly curved his eyebrows and said with a smile, "That's it?" Helion Theo was stunned when he heard Feng Maching's words. "If it's not that, do you want me to say something else?" Feng Maching silently took another step forward. Helion Theo hurriedly retreated, and a trace of embarrassment appeared on his face. He glared at Feng Maching and said, I'm just afraid that you'll say something you shouldn't say. Oh? What should I say that I shouldn't say? Why don't you tell me? Feng Maching approached step by step, and Helian Theo retreated somewhat pathetically. In the end, when he was almost forced onto the dragon bed, Helian Theo shouted, Enough. This is the Northern Pastoral, not your territory. Helian Theo took a deep breath and said. Chapter 21-23. Oh. Feng Maching suddenly stopped in his tracks. With his hands behind his back, he looked at Helian Theo and said, You still haven't answered my question. Why didn't you choose an empress? Why didn't you enter the harem? That's my business. What does it have to do with you? Helian Theo turned his head away stiffly. If you don't leave, I'll call for help. Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo's nervous expression and smiled faintly. He said calmly, Helian Theo, I'll make you admit it sooner or later. After Feng Maching finished speaking, he turned around and left. After Helian Xiu saw that Feng Maching had left, he slowly heaved a sigh of relief. Unknowingly, he was actually so nervous. The beating of his heart in his chest was so clear. Helian Xiu did not know why, but when he looked at the empty palace, he felt a strong sense of loss. This feeling made Helian Xiu very uncomfortable. After taking a deep breath, he suppressed the churning thoughts in his heart. The next morning. Did your majesty not rest well last night? Do you want this servant to cancel the morning court session? The head eunuch asked worriedly when he saw the dark circles under Helian Theo's eyes. After so many years, this was the first time he saw the emperor like this. We're fine. Let's go. Helian Theo frowned slightly and raised his hand to rub his eyebrows. This was the first time in many years that he couldn't sleep because of someone. Helian Theo was a little irritated. He kept thinking about Feng Maching, who appeared last night, and what Feng Maching said. By the end of the day, almost everyone felt that Helian Xiu was absent-minded. The head eunuch also broke out in a cold sweat for Helian Xiu. Fortunately, there were no major problems. At night, Helian Xiu dragged his tired body back to his own bedroom. Did you miss me so much that you lost your appetite? Absent-minded? Just as Helian Theo entered the inner chamber, he heard a familiar voice. It made Helian Theo's body freeze again. Why is it you again? Helian Theo frowned and said unhappily. You didn't sleep last night? You're also absent-minded today. It seems like you really miss me. Feng Maching moved closer to Helian Theo to take a look. He was so close that Helian Theo was shocked. Just as he was about to dodge, Feng Maching straightened his body. Seeing that you missed me so much, I naturally came as you wished. Feng Maching looked at Helian Xiu with a smile and said. Helian Xiu looked at Feng Maching's expression and frowned, feeling very conflicted. He opened his mouth and said, My palace's defense is so weak. Even a second-rate expert like you couldn't stop him. Second-rate? Feng Maching's face darkened. He looked at Helian Theo with displeasure and asked, In your eyes, I'm just a second-rate. Am I wrong? Helian Theo smiled faintly and said, Can you beat Xiao Chen? Feng Maching suddenly fell silent. A feeling of displeasure rose in his heart. So he was being looked down upon. However, Helian Theo's words seemed to make sense. He really couldn't beat Xiao Chen. Although it was the truth, why did Feng Maching feel so uncomfortable when it came from Helian Theo's mouth? Chapter 21-24. Feng Maching was silent. It's good that I can beat you. What does Xiao Chen have to do with me? Feng Maching said quietly. The meaning behind his words made Helian Theo's heart skip a beat. His heartbeat instantly accelerated. I have nothing to do with you. Helian Theo turned around and said, I want to take a bath. Leave quickly. What a coincidence. I also want to take a bath. Why don't we do it together? Feng Maching said with a smile as he looked at Helian Theo. You damned lecher. Get lost. Hellion Theo's beautiful face flushed red. His flustered and exasperated voice sounded. Hellion Theo probably forgot to control his volume and alerted the people outside the hall. Immediately, they heard the questioning voice from outside the hall. Hellion Theo was startled, but he quickly stabilized himself and said, "I'm fine. There's no need to come in." Feng Maching stood to the side and looked at Hellion Theo's appearance. His pitch-black eyes unconsciously softened and a faint smile appeared on his face. Looking at Hellion Theo's every move seemed to be pleasing to the eye. "Why are you still standing there? Leave quickly. Are you waiting for someone to catch you?" Hellion Theo turned around and saw that Feng Maching was still standing at the same spot. He was instantly furious and shouted anxiously. After hearing Hellion Theo's words, Feng Maching smiled calmly. "I'll come and find you tomorrow." Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo and said before turning around and leaving. "Who wants you to come?" Hellion Shou spoke with a look of disdain, but the faint smile at the corners of his mouth could not be concealed no matter what. For many days in a row, Feng Maching came every night. Hellion Theo chased Feng Maching away again and again, but he couldn't stop Feng Maching at all. Hellion Theo was also helpless. Until recently, Feng Maching, who came every day, suddenly stopped coming. After not seeing Feng Maching for 3 days in a row, Hellion Theo, who didn't care at first, suddenly felt uneasy. "Your Majesty, it's time to eat." This was the umpteenth time the head eunuch had said this to Hellion Theo. It was already late when Hellion Theo sat on the dragon throne, but Hellion Theo didn't seem to have any intention of eating. "No need. Let's leave. I'm not hungry." Hellion Theo waved his hand in annoyance. What he was thinking was, did Feng Maching just appear randomly and disappear again? At the thought of this, Hellion Theo felt suffocated. He put down the memorial in his hand in annoyance, stood up, and walked in the back garden. He looked at the dark night sky and unconsciously clenched his fists. His brows were tightly knitted, as if they had never relaxed. The head eunuch who followed Hellion Shou looked at Hellion Shou's appearance and also frowned. A few days ago, the emperor seemed to be in a good mood. Why did he become like this these few days? "Your Majesty, is there something you are worried about?" the head eunuch asked cautiously. Hellion Theo was silent for a moment. He looked into the distance and asked absent-mindedly, "Do you know what it feels like to like someone?" "Ah." When Hellion Shou asked this question, the head eunuch was immediately dumbfounded. He furrowed his brows slightly in silence, as if he was considering how to answer. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "This servant has entered the palace since I was young. What is the feeling of liking someone? This servant truly does not know." Chapter 21-25. This servant is just a eunuch. I don't have the right to like anyone. After the chief eunuch spoke, he suddenly thought of something. He looked at Hellion Theo in surprise and asked, "Your Majesty, do you have someone you like?" "No." Hellion Shou was questioned by the head eunuch. His heart suddenly jumped fiercely, as if he was trying to hide something. He quickly said a sentence, then turned around and walked away, saying, "Let's go back to the palace." It was hard for the chief eunuch not to be suspicious when he saw Hellion Theo's reaction. He looked at Hellion Theo in horror and watched as Hellion Theo entered the palace. His eyes widened as if he had thought of something. Why did His Majesty's words sound like he was begging for something but couldn't get it? The chief eunuch immediately thought of the time when Hellion Theo said that he wanted to marry Jingyu. When the 9th imperial concubine wasn't the 9th imperial concubine, and when His Majesty was still a prince, didn't he? Could it be that His Majesty is still thinking about the 9th imperial concubine? So after so many years, he was still thinking about the 9th imperial concubine and didn't even go to the harem? The more the chief eunuch thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. His eyes were filled with worry. If Jingyu wasn't the 9th imperial concubine, it would be easy to handle. However, Jingyu was the 9th imperial concubine and was even the mother of 2 children. He didn't even want to think about it. At this moment, the head eunuch's heart was broken. If Helian Shou knew that his casual question had actually caused this person's imagination to run wild like this, he would definitely control his own mouth next time. Helian Shou very calmly stepped into his own bedroom. When he stepped into the palace today, he sensed a different smell. There was a faint smell of blood. Helian Theo's expression instantly changed. When he turned around and entered the inner room, he immediately saw the man lying on the ground. His body was covered in blood, and there was incense burning in the room. The smell was very strong, and the pale face on the ground was none other than Feng Maching. Damn it! Helian Theo's heart almost jumped out when he saw this scene. He quickly went forward to help Feng Maching sit up and checked the wound on Feng Maching's body. Fortunately, the wound wasn't deep, but there was a lot of blood. At first glance, it was obvious that the wound had not been bandaged for a long time. Are you crazy? Helian Theo's eyes were full of anger as he said, "You could have bandaged yourself, so why didn't you? Waiting for death?" Cough cough. Feng Maching narrowed his eyes weakly, looked at Helian Theo, and said, "If I bandaged myself, how could I play the trick of injuring myself in front of you?" You. Helian Theo took a deep breath and didn't say anything else. He helped Feng Maching sit down on a chair at the side and quickly rummaged through the cabinets to find something like an emergency bandage. Feng Maching panted slightly and glanced at the wounds on his body. He reached out and took off his clothes with difficulty. The exposed upper body had a rather deep wound on the left side of his chest. Other than this wound, one could also see that Feng Maching had many scars on his body. If this wound was a little deeper, you would have gone to see the King of Hell. Helian Theo looked at Feng Maching's wound with a slightly cold expression. This young master is lucky. How can I bear to see the King of Hell before I marry you? Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo, who was applying medicine for him, and a faint smile appeared in his eyes as he said calmly. Chapter 21-26. Helian Theo's face instantly turned cold when he heard that. He reached out and pressed down hard. Hiss, be gentle, Feng Maching hurriedly said. His face turned even paler. Looking at Helian Theo's embarrassed and angry look, he didn't know why, but he actually felt that it was so cute. Looking at Helian Theo's serious look of bandaging the wound, he slightly arched his eyebrows. Who did it? Helian Theo asked after bandaging the wound. Who doesn't have an enemy in the pugilistic world? Feng Maching said casually. He reached out and put on his clothes before saying, I was just careless and got ambushed. Don't worry, I will settle this score sooner or later. Helian Theo glanced at Feng Maching when he heard that. After a moment of silence, he frowned and asked, What have you been doing for so many days? When Feng Maching heard Helian Theo's question, he turned his head to look at Helian Theo in surprise and asked, Are you concerned about me? I just want to know when you will die next time. Helian Theo smiled coldly. These words made Feng Maching feel very amused. Looking at Helian Theo's obviously concerned expression, but he just didn't admit it. It was really funny. Didn't I just say that I didn't marry? Feng Maching was about to speak when Helian Theo glanced at him coldly. Feng Maching immediately changed the topic and said very calmly, How can I die without marrying a wife? Helian Theo looked at Feng Maching's shameless expression. He was so angry that the roots of his teeth itched, but there was nothing he could do. Feng Maching was seriously injured, so he naturally stayed in Helian Theo's bedroom. Helian Theo almost never left the bedroom. Even if he went out, he ordered that no one was allowed to enter. Food and other things were sent in. The servants outside could clearly feel that their emperor's appetite had increased. After half a month, Feng Maching's injuries were almost healed. Helian Theo helped Feng Maching change his dressing as usual. Looking at the wounds that were almost healed, he nodded in satisfaction. It's almost healed. You can leave now. Helian Theo didn't hesitate to chase him away. Ouch! It hurts. It's not healed yet. Feng Maching said nothing and lay down again. Hellion Theo looked at Feng Maching's face. He had never seen such a thick-skinned person. Just when Hellion Theo was about to speak, he heard the chief eunuch's voice came from outside. Your Majesty, concubine sent someone's to bring some snacks. Hellion Theo frowned when he heard that. Just as he was about to refuse, Feng Maching stopped him and said happily, I'm hungry. Bring it in. If you don't want to eat, I'll eat it. Hellion Theo looked at Feng Maching's matter-of-fact expression and was so angry that he didn't recover for a long time. However, when he turned around, he asked the servant to put the food down. After the servant left, Hellion Theo brought the soup in and placed it beside Feng Maching. TSK. You're really lucky. Feng Maching looked at the soup and stared at Hellion Theo with a strange expression. He narrowed his eyes and said, so many women are throwing themselves at you, but you're indifferent. Why? It has nothing to do with you. Hellion Theo turned around with a cold expression when he heard that. Feng Maching stood up with a dark expression and frowned when he saw Hellion Theo's back facing him. Chapter 21-27. Hellion Theo, admit it. You're the same as me. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo quietly and said, you're no longer interested in women. Shut up. Hellion Theo abruptly turned his head and glared at Feng Maching angrily. Get out of here right now. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo's flustered and exasperated look. For some reason, he suddenly smiled happily. He looked at Hellion Theo quietly and said, what are you afraid of? Why? It's not that you refuse to accept me and accept yourself. Hellion Theo panted heavily and didn't say anything. He clenched his fists tightly by his side. Feng Maching didn't drink the soup and left just like that. He left as suddenly as he had arrived. They hadn't seen each other for a month. Hellion Theo's birthday came, and the whole country was celebrating. There were banquets and singing and dancing. The young women at the banquet were trying their best to please Hellion Theo. However, Hellion Xiu turned a blind eye to it. That cold and detached appearance of his had broken the hearts of countless women. Are you tired, Your Majesty? A soft voice drifted over. Hellion Xiu slightly paused his hand that was drinking wine. He turned his head to look and saw a beautiful woman dressed in decent clothes looking at him with a face full of concern. I'm fine. Concubine Jing, come with me to the back garden. Hellion Theo stood up and said. Concubine Jing seemed to be surprised when she heard this. Then, a look of surprise appeared in her eyes. She quickly stood up and complied. Some of the concubines below saw this scene and were immediately envious. The emperor treated everyone the same, but concubine Jing was different. She was always by the emperor's side. Seeing the two of them walk away hand in hand, the officials burst into tears. The emperor was finally enlightened. Northern Pastoral had an heir. Concubine Jing stayed by Hellion Theo's side. Time hadn't left much of a mark on Hellion Theo. She was still as beautiful as ever. Her long and narrow eyes were even more charming. Hellion Theo sighed deeply and strolled in the garden without saying a word. Hellion Theo didn't say anything, so concubine Jing naturally didn't dare to say anything. She just quietly stayed by Hellion Theo's side. How long have you been in the palace? Hellion Theo suddenly asked as he walked. Replying to Your Majesty, Qinxie has been in the palace for 7 years. Concubine Jing bowed in response. Her tone sounded calm, but the resentment in her voice was still there. Hellion Theo turned around and looked at concubine Jing. Her pretty face made him feel comfortable. Serve me in Longxiang Palace tonight, Hellion Theo said before he turned around and left. Concubine Jing was left standing there in shock. Her heart raced uncontrollably at that very moment. 7 years. Concubine Jing had thought that she had no chance at all. The cold treatment she had received over the past 7 years was enough to dishearten anyone. However, she didn't expect the emperor to change so much during these days. The day that concubine Jing had been waiting for had finally come. When the head eunuch heard the news, he was so excited that he almost jumped up. He hurriedly called for people to come and change the bedding in the palace. He even lit incense. After Helian Shou returned from the study room, he saw the changes in the room. Immediately, he frowned, feeling extremely conflicted. "Muda, did you do this?" Helian Theo called out with a cold face. Chapter 21-28. Your servant specially prepared it for your majesty, he. Muda was the head eunuch's name. When he heard Helian Theo calling out to him, he immediately chuckled and came up to him. Helian Theo's face instantly darkened when he saw how eager Muda was to take credit. "Are you tired of living?" Helian Theo said coldly as he looked at Muda. "Please spare me, your majesty. Concubine Jing is already waiting for your majesty's favor in the inner room," Muda quickly said when he saw that his attempt at flattery had failed. Scram! Helian Theo spat out a single word and walked in with cold steps. Helian Theo suddenly felt very strange when he smelled the ambiguous fragrance in the room and looked at the meticulously prepared gauze canopy. He stopped at the side of the bed and couldn't go forward no matter what. "Your Majesty!" A soft voice called out to him. It was obvious that concubine Jing had just finished bathing. She was wearing a light gauze, and her faintly discernible skin was extremely seductive. Any man who saw her would have thoughts about her. However, Helian Shou was unmoved. "What are you thinking, your majesty? Do I look good?" Concubine Jing took a deep breath when she saw Helian Theo standing there unmoving. Then, she boldly walked up to Helian Theo and reached out to hook her arms around Helian Theo's neck. Concubine Jing had some confidence in her looks and figure. She didn't believe that the emperor wouldn't be moved by her seductive appearance. Helian Theo looked at concubine Jing quietly and tried to convince himself over and over again. Just as he was about to reach out and hug her, he saw a black shadow flash before his eyes. Then, concubine Jing, who had her arms around his neck, was knocked unconscious. "Feng Maching, are you crazy?" Helian Shou's eyes were filled with astonishment as he looked at Feng Maching, who had barged in, and then looked at the person who had been knocked unconscious by Feng Maching without hesitation. The astonishment in his eyes could not be concealed. "I am crazy." Feng Maching's face was filled with anger as he said, "If the people from the Constellation Palace didn't inform me, were you planning to make this woman your empress tonight?" Constellation Palace. Helian Theo was stunned. Why would the Constellation Palace even inquire about such matters? "Yes." Feng Maching kicked concubine Jing away with a look of disdain. He stared at Helian Theo coldly and said, "Everyone knows about my feelings for you. Only you turned a blind eye." Feng Maching. "You." When Helian Theo heard Feng Maching's words, he was so shocked that he was completely speechless. His face was full of panic. "I was too foolish to allow you to slowly accept me. Now, it seems that this won't work." After saying that, Feng Maching glanced coldly at concubine Jing, who was lying on the ground. His eyes were filled with disgust. "Jin Cheng, throw this woman somewhere else. You know what to do." As soon as Feng Maching finished speaking, another person appeared from the darkness. Helian Theo's eyebrows twitched as he watched from the side. He suddenly realized how bad the security in his palace was. It wasn't enough for Feng Maching to come in alone. He even brought in a subordinate. "Yes." Jin Cheng responded respectfully. He reached out to grab the unconscious concubine Jing and ran out of the window. Then, only Feng Maching and Helian Theo were left in the room. "Now, it's time for us to settle the score." Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo calmly and said. Chapter 21-29. What are you trying to do? Helian Theo looked at Feng Maching, who was approaching him, and immediately retreated with vigilance. He frowned slightly. First, tell me what you did when I wasn't around for a month. Feng Maching wasn't in a hurry. He just looked at Helian Theo quietly and asked in a very calm tone. It sounded like a greeting between good friends. However, there was a strange tone in his words. Why did he sound like he was questioning him? Do I need to report to you what I did? Helian Theo pursed his lips and stared at Feng Maching. Didn't you leave? What are you doing here? Leave? Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo and said, Are you chasing me away? You chased me away once 5 years ago. Now you want to chase me away again? Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo and frowned deeply. He stepped closer to Helian Theo and asked, Do you hate me so much? If that's the case, then kill me. Feng Maching. Helian Theo looked at the dagger Feng Maching took out and his expression changed. Why can't you bear to? Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo's nervous expression and smiled faintly. You. Helian Theo looked at Feng Maching and was speechless for a long time. Feng Maching wasn't in a hurry. He just stood there and looked at Helian Theo quietly. Where did your men take concubine Jing? Helian Theo took a deep breath and asked. Killed her. Feng Maching's face turned cold when he heard Helian Theo's question. He turned his head and said. Helian Theo stared at Feng Maching. Feng Maching was a lunatic, so it was really possible for him to do such a thing. Helian Theo didn't say anything and just stared at Feng Maching. If you're so concerned about a concubine, why don't you ask me where I've been for the past month? Feng Maching felt deeply hurt and glared at Helian Theo. What does that have to do with me? Helian Theo snorted and turned his head away. Helian Theo, tell me why you won't accept me. Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo quietly. Looking at the side of Helian Theo's face, Feng Maching had initially thought that Helian Theo hated him. However, over the past 5 years, he had seen it clearly. Helian Theo didn't hate him. What he said back then was just to drive him away. Hearing Feng Maching's serious question, Helian Shou's heart trembled slightly, but he stood there silently without saying a word. His heart was thumping, as if there were countless words he wanted to say, but he couldn't say a single word. Feng Maching, leave. Never come back. Helian Theo was silent for a long time before he finally lowered his eyes and said. You know that I can't do it. Feng Maching answered firmly. I'm a man. I like women. Do you understand? Helian Shou abruptly turned his head and glared at Feng Maching fiercely. Do you think I'll believe you? Feng Maching smiled disdainfully and said, That woman seduced you just now, but you didn't feel anything. Now you're telling me that you like a woman. Don't you think it's ridiculous? When Helian Theo heard Feng Maching's words, it was as if he had been poked in a sore spot. His expression instantly turned ugly. Alright, since you said that you like a woman, why don't we prove it? Chapter 2130. Feng Maching suddenly smiled and calmly looked at Helian Shou as he spoke. Helian Theo was stunned when he heard that. He looked up at Helian Theo and asked with a frown, What do you mean by that? That's exactly what I mean. Feng Maching said with a heavy gaze. He stepped forward and caught Helian Theo off guard. He reached out to grab Helian Theo's head and kissed him without saying a word. When those slightly cold thin lips pressed down, Helian Shou's eyes suddenly widened. This kind of familiar touch, that scorching tongue that wandered around his own lips, caused Helian Shou's mind to instantly go blank. Feng Maching. You lunatic. Get out. Get out. After Helian Shou came back to his senses, he reached out and pushed Feng Maching away. Feng Maching was still immersed in the kiss and was pushed to the bed before he could react. Oh. So you're so wild. Feng Maching was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked at himself and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his eyes. He lay on the bed and said, I'm ready. Come. You. Helian Theo was so angry that he didn't want to stay here any longer. He flicked his sleeves and turned around. Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo's departing figure. His eyes darkened bit by bit. There was an unconcealable pain on his handsome face. He wasn't as relaxed as he was when he faced Helian Theo. When concubine Jing woke up, she saw her own palace. She didn't feel uncomfortable at all. In other words, what she expected to happen last night didn't happen at all. Dongji, when did I come back? Concubine Jing rubbed her head and asked in a daze. Your Highness, His Majesty personally sent you back this morning. Dongji's face was full of excitement. Looking at her Nyang, she was very moved and said, His Majesty is so good to Nyang. Nyang should have a good rest. Oh. Concubine Jing's heart skipped a beat when she heard that. It was obvious that the emperor hadn't touched her, so why was he acting like this? Concubine Jing had no idea what was going on at all. She was ordered to serve the emperor in bed for the next few days, and she was sent home by the emperor himself every morning. Everyone said that concubine Jing was the only one who was favored by the emperor, and that favor was bestowed upon her as well. She was made a noble consort and was in charge of the imperial harem. But only she knew that the emperor did not touch her at all. On the same night, Helian Xiu stepped into the bathing pool with exhaustion all over his body. The tiredness on the tip of his brows was difficult to conceal. Helian Xiu silently narrowed his eyes and looked at the mist above the pool. There was not the slightest emotion in his eyes. Footsteps sounded beside his ear, and they sounded very gentle. Your Majesty, this concubine is here to help your Majesty bathe. The person who came was naturally the newly promoted noble consort, Xia Qing. Helian Theo narrowed his eyes and didn't refuse. He let Xia Qing come over and reached out to help Helian Theo wipe his back. Looking at the side of Helian Theo's face, even a woman would be jealous of such a handsome face. Xia Qing's eyes were slightly silent. Her small hands were teasing him intentionally or unintentionally, causing Helian Xiu's eyes to twitch slightly. When he wanted to avoid it out of reflex, he seemed to have thought of something. His body did not move and he allowed Xia Qing to do what she wanted. Your Majesty. Xia Qing leaned against Helian Theo and called out in a very delicate voice. Helian Theo's hands, which were hidden in the water, clenched slightly. Chapter 21:31. The scorching wine slid down Helian Theo's throat. His eyes became even more confused. It was as if he couldn't remember anything at this moment. But why was the figure in his mind so clear? Helian Xiu was somewhat angry as he fiercely swung his hand and fiercely smashed the wine jar in his hand onto the ground. Your Majesty. When Helian Theo flung the wine jar away, Muda was so shocked that he hurriedly knelt down. Helian Theo roared in annoyance, Scram! All of you, scram! Muda's eyes were filled with worry. He had no idea what was going on with Helian Theo. Looking at the wine on the ground, he didn't dare to say a word. If he angered the emperor, even if he had a few heads, it wouldn't be enough for him to chop off. He hurriedly waved his hand and dismissed everyone in the hall. In this incomparably spacious hall, Helian Theo took a step forward and sat on the stone steps. He raised his head and looked at the hall. In an instant, he felt the pain in his heart magnifying infinitely. He didn't feel the slightest bit numb. Who was it that said to drown his sorrows in wine? His sorrows were even more sorrowful. Helian Xiu suddenly smiled and closed his eyes slightly. When he reached out his hand to take the wine jar at the side, his hand touched nothing but air. Drinking wine is harmful to the body. A familiar voice sounded. Helian Xiu's body suddenly froze. He slowly turned his head to look and saw Feng Maching standing beside him with a wine jar in his hand. Feng Maching was wearing a dark purple robe. Helian Theo slowly lowered his hand. He lowered his head and didn't look at Feng Maching. Don't be in such a hurry to chase me away. Feng Maching quietly looked at Helian Theo and said, I'm here to bid you farewell. You. Helian Theo raised his head and looked at Feng Maching. Then, as if he felt that his action was too big, he turned his head away unnaturally and said, "If you want to leave, just leave. Why are you talking to me?" After Hellion Theo said this, he did not hear a reply for a long time. Hellion Theo almost thought that Feng Maching had left. He quickly turned his head, but when he turned his head, he met Feng Maching's burning eyes. "I'm sorry," Feng Maching suddenly said as he looked at Hellion Theo. Hellion Theo's heart skipped a beat, but he remained silent. "In the future, I won't appear in front of you again." "You're right. I'm a man. In the future, I'll manage Sunluo Tower well, get married, and have children for the rest of my life." Feng Maching smiled lightly. "I'm very sorry for this period of time," Feng Maching said as he bowed slightly to Hellion Theo. "You?" Hellion Xiao looked at Feng Maching's expression and listened to Feng Maching's words. These words were what he had been looking forward to hearing, but now that he really heard them, he didn't feel the slightest bit of joy. He could even clearly feel the pain coming from his heart. That kind of pain was so clear that Hellion Theo's heart instantly clenched. "Today, I'm here to bid you farewell. Northern Pastoral is your painstaking effort. I understand." When Feng Maching said this, he smiled very calmly. He reached out and put the wine jar in his hand aside and said, "Tokyo has never let down his guard. I think you're the same. I'll help you." After Feng Maching said this, he turned around and was about to leave. "Stop." Hellion Theo was silent for a long time. Finally, when he saw Feng Maching turn around and leave, he suddenly raised his head and shouted. Hellion Theo stood up shakily and looked at Feng Maching, whose back was facing him. Chapter 2132. What do you mean by what you said just now? Hellion Theo asked as he stared at Feng Maching. His eyes were full of mockery. "You think you can come and go as you please? Do you really think this is Sunluo Tower?" Hellion Theo approached Feng Maching step by step. Looking at Feng Maching's tall figure with his back facing him, Hellion Theo felt very uncomfortable. "Isn't this what you've always wanted?" Feng Maching didn't turn around. With his back facing Hellion Theo, he said, "Don't worry, I won't come to this Northern Pastoral again." "Feng Maching, you bastard." When Hellion Theo heard Feng Maching's words, it was as if he had heard something extremely infuriating. He raised his hand, pulled Feng Maching over, and punched Feng Maching's face without hesitation. "Why do you have to say whatever you want?" Hellion Theo looked at Feng Maching's collapsed appearance and suddenly felt very comfortable. "Ah!" Feng Maching fell to the ground in a somewhat sorry state. He reached out to wipe the blood from the corner of his mouth and looked up at Hellion Theo. Hellion Theo's drunkenness had probably kicked in. His body, which was pouncing towards Feng Maching, was a little unstable. Feng Maching reflexively supported Hellion Theo. When he saw Hellion Theo raise his fist again, he raised his hand and grabbed Hellion Theo's wrist. Feng Maching's eyes were very calm. "Once is enough." Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo. At this moment, Hellion Theo was pressing down on Feng Maching and the two of them were lying on the ground. "Let go." Hellion Theo was grabbed by Feng Maching. He frowned and shouted. "This time, you pounced on me yourself. Why should I let go?" Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo with a faint smile in his eyes. When he looked at Hellion Theo, his eyes were filled with tenderness. This gaze made Hellion Theo's heart skip a beat. "You!" Hellion Theo was about to forcefully break free from Feng Maching's hand, but Feng Maching turned over and suppressed him. The two of them suddenly flipped over. In this spacious palace, the two of them were lying on the soft carpet. No matter how one looked at it, this scene was extremely ambiguous. Hellion Theo's eyes were filled with astonishment. He didn't know why the situation had turned out this way in the blink of an eye. He felt dizzy and completely lost the ability to think. Hellion Theo looked at Feng Maching and reached out to grab his collar. "Didn't you want to know the answer?" Hellion Theo stared at Hellion Theo. His narrowed eyes and smiled as if he wanted to say something. In an instant, Feng Maching held his breath, afraid that he would interrupt Helian Theo. However, just as Feng Maching's body stiffened as he waited, he saw Helian Shou slowly release his hand. Then, that pair of beautiful eyes slowly closed. His head tilted to the side and he actually fell asleep just like that. Even if you want to know, I won't tell you. These were the words that Helian Theo muttered. Helian Theo. You. Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo lying down and heard Helian Theo's last words. Suddenly, he felt extremely helpless. He had a belly full of anger, but there was nowhere to vent it. Looking at Helian Theo sleeping so comfortably, Feng Maching felt a deep sense of helplessness. He got up and bent down to carry Helian Theo to the bed. Looking at Helian Theo's incomparably beautiful face, the expression in his eyes was so complicated. What should I do? Feng Maching's words were so helpless. Chapter 2133. When Helian Shou woke up, the first thing he saw was a familiar curtain and, Feng Maching. Why are you on my bed? Helian Theo's brain crashed for a moment. He rubbed his aching head and looked at Feng Maching, who was looking at him with his head propped up. His eyes were filled with astonishment. Oh? Have you forgotten? Feng Maching was wearing a simple inner garment. His black hair was scattered as he looked at Helian Theo calmly and said, Last night, you cried and screamed for me not to leave. You even pulled me onto your bed. Don't you remember? Feng Maching, get out of my sight. Helian Shou's exasperated roar ferociously kicked Feng Maching off the dragon bed. He looked very angry, but his handsome face and even his ears were red. On this morning, all the ministers felt that it was very strange because their emperor's mind had started to wander. Moreover, the tips of his ears had been very red. That absent-minded look made Muda break out in cold sweat. Your Majesty, are you all right? Do you want the imperial physician to take a look? After the morning court session, Muda looked at Helian Theo worriedly and asked. I'm fine, Helian Theo said with a cold face. Your Majesty. Your Majesty. At this moment, a guard suddenly rushed over and said, There's a man holding your Majesty's token. He claims to be your Majesty's friend and is waiting outside the hall. The guard said as he presented the jade pendant in his hand. When Helian Theo saw the jade pendant, his face immediately turned green. Helian Shou was still wearing the jade pendant yesterday. However, after a night, it had actually fallen into the hands of someone else. It was obvious who the guard was talking about. Please come in. Even if Helian Shou did not want to meet him, Feng Maching had come to his door openly, so Helian Shou naturally had to meet him. When he saw Feng Maching, who was wearing a purple robe, walking in, Helian Shou was stunned. Helian Shou once again thought of what happened this morning. Immediately, the redness on the tip of his ears, which had disappeared with great difficulty, surfaced once again. Long time no see. Feng Maching's aura attracted the attention of everyone in the hall. Some of them looked at Feng Maching and Helian Theo curiously. All of you, leave. Helian Theo took a deep breath and waved his hand to dismiss everyone. When only Helian Theo and Feng Maching were left in the room, Helian Theo stood up from his seat and glared at Feng Maching angrily. What are you doing here? Isn't it enough for you to sneak in? You actually came in the open. Helian Shou was obviously quite angry. In order to see you openly, could it be that you prefer me to come secretly? Feng Maching narrowed his eyes and looked at Helian Theo teasingly. The meaning in his eyes seemed to be implying something. Helian Theo instantly blushed. Didn't you say yesterday that you were going to leave? Why haven't you left yet? Helian Theo wisely chose not to continue this topic. Otherwise, he really didn't know what else Feng Maching could say. I regret it, Feng Maching said happily. Feng Maching said happily, since our Emperor Helian is crying and begging me not to leave, then I naturally can't bear to leave. Feng Maching said with a smile, which immediately made Helian Shou's face turn ashen. Chapter 2134. Feng Maching, if you dare to mention this again. Hellion Theo glared at Feng Maching viciously. As long as you let me stay in the palace, I won't mention it again, Feng Maching quickly raised his hands and said seriously. In the palace of the Northern Pastoral Palace, Feng Maching was lying comfortably on a soft couch, enjoying the massage of a beautiful palace maid. He felt incomparably comfortable. When Hellion Theo finished his work and came over, he saw such a scene. Hee. It seems like Tower Master Feng really doesn't treat himself as an outsider. Hellion Theo stared coldly at Feng Maching. When Feng Maching saw Hellion Theo's arrival, he smiled happily. He stood up and looked at Hellion Theo, saying, I just want to experience how Emperor Hellion lives in the palace. It seems like he's living quite well. Hellion Theo's face darkened when he heard this. He waved his hand and dismissed everyone. Then, he walked towards Feng Maching and said, What are you doing in the palace? You know, don't you? Feng Maching narrowed his eyes and smiled. He looked at Hellion Theo and said, Wherever you are, I will be there. After all, you want me to stay, don't you? Feng Maching smiled again. Hellion Theo immediately shut his mouth. As expected, he couldn't say anything to Feng Maching. Otherwise, he wouldn't know what would come out of his mouth. Hellion Theo thought that Feng Maching would restrain himself when he came to the palace. However, he was obviously wrong. He was inviting a wolf into the house. Feng Maching, who allowed you to lie on my bed? After Hellion Theo took a bath and changed his clothes, he went into the inner room and saw Feng Maching lying on the bed in his underwear. His clothes were half open, revealing his muscular chest. Of course I'm here to serve you in bed. The corners of Hellion Theo's mouth twitched when he saw Feng Maching's devilish smile and the smile in his eyes. What should he do with this scoundrel? Could it be that His Majesty doesn't like me wearing clothes? It's okay, I can take it off myself. As Feng Maching spoke, he reached out to take off his clothes. Hellion Theo's face instantly turned red. He strode toward Feng Maching and reached out to pull Feng Maching down. Get out of here! Hellion Shou shouted with a cold face. You're still the most interesting when you're drunk. Without saying a word, Feng Maching pulled Hellion Theo into his embrace. His pitch-black eyes stared intently at Hellion Theo. The hand that was holding Hellion Theo did not move at all. How dare you! Hellion Theo's face turned red. He always felt that his posture was quite sullen. You're clearly thinking the same thing as me. Why won't you admit it? Feng Maching reached out to caress Hellion Theo's face. His eyes were filled with complicated emotions. Then, he smiled and said, It's okay, I have a lot of time. I can wait slowly. As Feng Maching spoke, he released the hand that was holding Hellion Theo. Hellion Theo straightened his body and looked at Feng Maching silently. He asked, Why? Why can you let go of so many worries and be so determined to be a moth to a flame without hesitation? Hellion Theo looked deeply at Feng Maching. The expression in his eyes was so serious. Why? Feng Maching suddenly smiled and said, Maybe it's because Jingyu gave me too much encouragement. That's why I came here so bravely. Chapter 2135. Jingyu. Hellion Theo's eyes were tinged with a faint hint of surprise. He didn't expect Feng Maching to suddenly mention Jingyu. Yes. Feng Maching narrowed his eyes slightly and said, When I left 5 years ago, I originally planned to never appear again. However, Jingyu's words made it clear to me that if I don't fight with my life on the line, how will I know the outcome? Feng Maching's words made Hellion Theo's breathing stagnate. He looked into Feng Maching's pitch-black eyes. The seriousness in his eyes was so moving. Have you thought about the outcome? Hellion Theo was silent for a moment before he suddenly asked. This was probably the most serious conversation the two of them had ever had. One was leaning against the bed, while the other was standing by the bed. The two of them looked at each other as if this moment would last forever. What outcome do you want? Feng Maching didn't answer Helian Theo's question. Instead, he pursed his lips and asked. Helian Theo's body stiffened when he heard Feng Maching's question. It's getting late. You should go back. Helian Theo turned his back. His silent appearance indicated that he chose to avoid the topic once again. Feng Maching looked at Helian Theo's appearance and couldn't help but feel angry. He suddenly stood up and reached out to grab Helian Theo's arm. With a cold expression, he said, "How long are you going to avoid the topic? What's the point of hiding like this? Aren't you the same? You can only hide like this forever." Helian Theo pursed his lips and emitted a very cold light. Feng Maching was stunned when he heard this. He looked at Helian Theo's appearance and suddenly laughed. "You've finally admitted it, haven't you? Helian Theo. I'll be very happy if you can continue like this." "What?" Helian Shou was stunned. Feng Maching suddenly approached Helian Shou. Before Helian Shou could prepare himself, Feng Maching kissed Helian Shou directly. The familiar touch made Helian Shou's brain crash. Feng Maching did not give Helian Shou the slightest chance to react. He directly reached out and grabbed Helian Shou, driving straight in. The candlelight in the room was burning. Feng Maching panted heavily and slowly let go of his hand. His pitch-black eyes stared intently at Helian Theo, who was lying under him. Looking at Helian Theo's red face and unsteady breathing, his eyes were filled with information. "Listen." Feng Maching picked up Helian Theo's hand and placed it on his heart. Helian Theo could clearly feel the strong heartbeat coming from his palm. The morning sun was a little dazzling. Helian Shou slowly opened his tightly shut long and narrow eyes. The feeling of a heavy object pressing down on his waist made Helian Shou's body stiffen. When he turned his head to look, the first thing he saw was Feng Maching's still sleeping face. "Feng Maching, didn't I tell you to get lost? Why are you on my bed again?" Helian Theo was about to go crazy. "Oh. Beauty, good morning." Feng Maching opened his eyes and looked at Helian Theo's angry appearance. He calmly smiled and said, "I don't know why I'm here." "You're probably sleepwalking," Feng Maching said as he moved closer to Helian Theo and planted a light kiss on Helian Theo's lips. "Your Majesty, it's time for you to go to court," Feng Maching said with a smile as he supported his chin and looked at Helian Theo's red face. As soon as he said this, Helian Theo immediately shut up. Chapter 2136. In the morning court, Helian Theo was sitting on the high seat. Although he didn't seem to have changed, the people who followed Helian Theo all year round could clearly feel that the emperor seemed to be in a good mood today. After the court ended, Helian Theo headed to the palace without thinking. "Your Majesty, the memorial." Muda looked at Helian Theo's actions and suddenly widened his eyes in surprise. He looked at Helian Theo and asked, "Send someone to bring it to my palace." Helian Theo paused when he heard this. After a moment of silence, he threw out this sentence and then turned around and continued to walk towards the palace. Muda was stunned. He didn't know why Helian Theo was doing this. But since the emperor ordered him to do so, he naturally did as he was told. After the memorial was sent in, the emperor dismissed everyone. Muda was confused. He seemed to have thought of something, but also seemed to have forgotten something. Helian Theo suddenly became very mysterious. He ignored the concubines even more. But at this time, a piece of news came. "What did you say?" Helian Theo sat on the high seat and looked at Muda, who came to report the news. His eyes were full of astonishment. "The imperial concubine is pregnant with the imperial son." Muda's words were full of joy. He repeated it again. Helian Theo's face was full of surprise. He didn't expect that incident would make Xia Qing pregnant. Helian Theo didn't know how to feel. At this moment, Helian Theo's feelings were incomparably complicated. Let the imperial physician nurse the imperial concubine's body well. Be sure to protect my imperial son. Hellion Theo was silent for a moment. After saying this sentence to Muda, he stood up and seemed to be about to leave. Your Majesty! Aren't you going to see the imperial concubine? Looking at Hellion Theo's unchanged face, Mulder was slightly stunned. Then, he blinked his eyes and looked at Hellion Theo in confusion. We won't be going over. Hellion Theo was stunned when he heard this, but he said quietly, from today onwards, the imperial consort's health is the most important. No matter what, the imperial consort must give birth to this child. If anyone dares to harm the imperial consort, kill them on the spot. Yes. Muda's body trembled when he heard this. He instantly understood what Hellion Theo meant. What Hellion Theo valued was the child in Xia Qing's belly, not Xia Qing herself. Muda went to the imperial concubine's residence and brought all the good rewards. It seemed like a favor, but the emperor never showed up. This made the imperial concubines very curious. They didn't know what the emperor meant by doing this. But from the looks of it, he didn't seem to care much about the imperial concubine. Hellion Theo returned to his bedroom. As soon as he stepped into the bedroom, he was hugged tightly. Hellion Theo was so shocked that he almost reached out to hit the person. Before he could say anything, his head was grabbed and fiercely kissed. They kissed until Hellion Theo was dizzy and didn't let go. Your concubine is pregnant? Feng Maching's hoarse voice sounded. A pair of pitch-black eyes stared intently at Hellion Theo as he asked. Yes. Hellion Theo's lips were very red. He didn't dare to raise his head to look at Feng Maching. For some reason, he felt like he was caught in the act. That was an accident. Hellion Theo waited for a long time, but Feng Maching didn't answer. He quickly raised his head and said. Seeing Feng Maching's silent appearance, he felt a little uneasy. Chapter 2137. Yes, it was an accident. Feng Maching's eyes were deep as he slowly released Hellion Theo. When Hellion Theo saw Feng Maching's expression, he suddenly felt uncomfortable and sat silently at the side. Feng Maching didn't hug Hellion Theo like he usually did. He stayed for a while before leaving. Hellion Theo leaned back in his chair in annoyance. This was the first time he was so upset. This child came too suddenly and caught Hellion Theo off guard. However, after thinking about it carefully, this child didn't seem to be a bad thing. Hellion had an heir. The Northern Pastoral had an heir after all. Hellion Theo knew very well that he couldn't bear a child with another woman. Therefore, this child was very important. However, Hellion Theo was a little worried. When this child grew up, if he found out about his father, when he thought of this, Hellion Theo felt a sharp pain in his heart. He silently closed his eyes. Some things had to be faced. Perhaps it would be a good thing. Hellion Theo's mind was filled with wild thoughts. At this moment, Hellion Theo suddenly thought of Jingyu. If it was Jingyu, Jingyu would definitely choose to face this situation without hesitation. Such a special woman was always so dazzling. Hellion Theo smiled faintly. Every day, he would listen to the imperial concubine's reports from the imperial concubine. In his heart, he was thinking about how he hadn't seen Feng Maching for 3 to 4 days. For the first time, Hellion Theo felt a little annoyed. What has my friend been doing these days? Hellion Theo couldn't help but ask after holding it in for a long time. Is your Majesty talking about Tower Lord Feng? When Muda heard Hellion Theo's question, he was momentarily stunned. After a moment of silence, he said, Tower Lord Feng seems to have left the palace. Left the palace? Why didn't I know anything about it? Hellion Theo widened his eyes in shock when he heard that Feng Maching had left the palace. Didn't His Majesty give Manor Lord Feng the right to freely enter and exit the palace? That's why Manor Lord Feng didn't report her entry and exit. Hellion Theo had told everyone that Feng Maching was his savior. Everyone in the palace was extremely respectful to Feng Maching. Hearing the emperor's tone now, could it be that he was blaming him for not reporting it? Muda silently wiped off his sweat and stood still, not daring to move. We understand. You may leave. Just as Mulder was about to be reprimanded by Hellion Theo said this and continued reading the memorials as if nothing had happened. Muda was confused, but he didn't dare to ask any questions. He silently retreated. Another 2 days passed, and Feng Maching was still nowhere to be seen. Hellion suddenly recalled what Feng Maching had said when he came over. He said that he was leaving. A few days ago, Feng Maching was clearly unhappy about the palace concubine's pregnancy. Could it be that Feng Maching had silently left without saying goodbye? When Hellion Theo thought of this possibility, his expression immediately changed. He abruptly stood up and anxiously walked towards Feng Maching's palace. When he reached the palace's entrance, Hellion Theo stopped in his tracks. All this time, Feng Maching had been the one to look for him and follow him. This was the first time he had come to Feng Maching's residence. You all wait outside. Hellion coldly threw down a sentence before stepping into the room. Chapter 2138. Muda didn't notice Hellion Theo's reddened face and didn't know what had happened. After that, Hellion Theo was injured from time to time. Muda was very worried, but he complained that brothel master Feng shouldn't have used her power just because she was the emperor's savior. However, Muda saw that Hellion Theo didn't say anything, so he naturally couldn't say anything as a servant. The cold winter arrived in the blink of an eye. Hellion wrapped himself in a thick coat and walked into Feng Maching's courtyard. Inside the house, Feng Maching was handing the letter in his hand to the guard beside him. When he saw Hellion enter, he raised his hand and waved his hand to dismiss him. Why did you call me over in such a hurry? Hellion Theo looked suspiciously at the guard who left with the envelope. He frowned and turned to Feng Maching. Did something happen at Sunluo Tower? Nothing. Feng Maching reached out and hugged Hellion Theo in his arms. He said casually, there have been a lot of assassination missions recently, but it has nothing to do with us. Oh. Hellion Theo wanted to ask something, but Feng Maching covered his mouth. Your Majesty should come warm the bed. Feng Maching said vaguely. Hellion Theo raised his hand and struggled. Feng Maching was always like this. Every time he saw Feng Maching's infatuated expression, Hellion Theo felt his heart tremble. The temperature in the room rose little by little. The rolling body under the red candlelight was silent and oppressive. From within the courtyard, a black shadow silently flashed out. When he appeared in the empty space outside the palace, he took out the letter from his bosom and walked towards a house to have someone deliver the letter. In the Roman forest, the winter seemed to be even colder. White snow covered the entire Roman forest. When the sun came out during the day, a gray wolf could be seen striding out. On top of this gray wolf sat a small figure. Wow! So beautiful! The person sitting on the back of the gray wolf was naturally Xiao Xin. He had not seen him for a year, but he seemed to have grown a lot. Yes! A very calm voice came from behind him. Naturally, it was Xiao Zian. Father! Mother! Look at these icicles! Xiao Xin got down from Yin Jian's body, and raised his head in surprise. After Xiao Xin finished his words, he saw a window open on the tree trunk. Jingyu, who was wrapped in a robe, poked her head out and looked at the snow-white scenery outside. She narrowed her eyes and said, You too, be careful. I know, mother. Xiao Xin smiled and responded. Then, he went to play in the snow and ice with his short legs. It's so cold. Jingyu sighed. Xiao Qin appeared behind Jingyu at some point in time. He reached out to hug Jingyu and said, Northern Pastoral Feng Maching sent a letter. Ah! A letter. When Jingyu heard this, she was very happy and opened her eyes wide. She turned to Xiao Qin and asked, Where's the letter? Give it to me. Xiao Qin looked at Jingyu's excited appearance and suddenly frowned. Ha ha ha. Jingyu looked at the contents of the letter. The smile in her eyes became bigger and bigger. She said with a smile, "Feng Maching is really smart. He got it so quickly. I thought it would take a long time." Chapter 2139. It's Hellion Theo who is too stupid. Xiao Chen naturally knew what Jing Yu was talking about. He frowned slightly. "Oh. But it's a pity that I didn't get to see how the two of them get along," Jing Yu said with a faint smile. Xiao Chen's face turned cold when he heard Jing Yu's words. He said strangely, "What does it have to do with you how they get along?" Xiao Chen was already unhappy that Jing Yu was meddling in their affairs. Now that he heard Jing Yu's words, he felt even more uncomfortable. "I'm just curious." "Husband, don't be angry." Jing Yu sensed Xiao Chen's unhappiness and immediately hugged Xiao Chen's neck obediently. Xiao Chen looked at Jing Yu's fawning expression and snorted proudly. The displeasure on his face dissipated. Linglan, Miaoqiu, and Su Yu are all very curious. I'll write a letter to tell them. Jing Yu seemed to have thought of something and excitedly went to write a letter. Xiao Chen's body stiffened when he heard this. He silently mourned for Hellion Theo in his heart. It seemed that no one knew about this matter, but in fact, almost everyone knew about it. This woman was really irresistible when it came to gossiping. If Hellion Theo knew that Feng Maching actually made this matter known to everyone, he would definitely strangle Feng Maching to death. However, Hellion Theo didn't know about it for the time being. Feng Maching left for a month because of the matter at Sunluo Tower. When he returned, it was already spring. In 2 months, Xia Qing would give birth. During these few days, even if Hellion Theo didn't want to, he would still go to Xia Qing's palace to take a look. However, he only went to take a look. Why? Why doesn't the emperor want to look at me? Xia Qing was pregnant with a child and should have been plump, but she seemed to have lost weight. The sadness between her eyebrows couldn't dissipate. "Your Highness, please take care of your health," the palace maid beside her said worriedly when she saw Xia Qing in such a state. Take care, take care. All of you are thinking about this child." Xia Qing had been suppressing her temper for a long time. Everyone who came to talk to her about the child. Xia Qing couldn't stand it anymore. Every time the emperor came, he would routinely ask about the child and nothing else. Xia Qing suddenly became very resentful. She suddenly remembered what happened with Hellion Theo in the bath. At that time, Hellion Xiu was so scary, but Xia Qing was wondering if she had done something wrong. Why did the emperor hate her so much? "Your Highness, please forgive us." The palace maids knelt on the ground and didn't dare to breathe loudly. "Let me ask you. Has the emperor been to the other palace concubines these days?" Xia Qing suppressed the emotions in her heart and looked at the palace maids calmly. "Your Highness, the emperor hasn't been to any of your palaces. He has been dealing with government affairs. Occasionally, he would go to the West Side Hall to compete in martial arts or play chess with Tower Lord Feng." The palace maid quickly answered this time. "Tower Lord Feng?" Xia Qing frowned. She had heard this name often recently. Xia Qing naturally knew Tower Lord Feng's identity. However, in Xia Qing's opinion, she was just a boorish person who couldn't be seen in public. Chapter 2140. However, Xia Qing found it strange that His Majesty valued her so much. "Does His Majesty go there often?" Xia Qing pursed her lips slightly and said, "Speaking of which, His Majesty's great benefactor lives in this palace. As the master of this palace, I do have to go there and take a look. Make the arrangements tomorrow." "But Your Highness, your body." The palace maid was stunned when she heard Xia Qing's words. Then, she said worriedly, "It's fine. Isn't there still half a month before I give birth? I haven't gone out for a long time." Xia Qing looked at her big belly and said calmly, "Yes." The palace maid still wanted to comfort her, but when she saw Xia Qing's gaze, she immediately shrank back and responded respectfully, Helian Theo was completely unaware that his actions had attracted Xia Qing's attention. The next day, Feng Maching was reading the news brought by his subordinates as usual. During this period of time, the underworld had begun to become active again. There were really a lot of killing jobs. Feng Maching felt that he had been idle for a long time. Should he also take on a mission and go out to kill people for fun? Feng Maching was looking at these missions with great interest when he heard that the imperial concubine had come to visit. Feng Maching was stunned. Why did the imperial concubine of Helian Theo come to visit him? And this imperial concubine was pregnant, right? Feng Maching knew how important this child was to Helian Theo. He thought that since it was Helian Theo's child, it was naturally his child. Thinking of this, the corners of Feng Maching's mouth curled up. He seemed to anticipate that the scene of him raising a child with Helian Theo in the future would be very interesting. Since the imperial concubine had come to visit, Feng Maching naturally wouldn't ignore her for the sake of Helian Theo. With this thought, he stepped out and asked someone to invite the imperial concubine to the reception room. It wasn't the first time Feng Maching saw Xia Qing, but it was the first time Xia Qing saw Feng Maching. When she saw Feng Maching walk in from outside, Xia Qing was really stunned. Feng Maching was dressed in a dark purple robe. He didn't wear it in a formal manner, but he looked elegant. Greetings, imperial concubine. Feng Maching wasn't a member of the palace, so this salute was just a casual greeting. Lowering his head slightly was considered a greeting. Tower Lord Feng, you don't have to be so courteous. Xia Qing looked at Feng Maching's salute and felt a little unhappy in her heart. However, when she thought of the relationship between Feng Maching and Helian Theo, she didn't say anything. This consort heard that Tower Master Feng has been staying in the palace for some time. This consort was pregnant and didn't have the time to visit. Didn't this consort finally have the time to come over today? I hope that Tower Master Feng won't take offense. Xia Qing's haughty manner made Feng Maching frown in displeasure. I wonder if Tower Lord Feng is used to living here. If there's anything, feel free to tell me. Xia Qing smiled generously. Imperial concubine Nyang Nyang is too polite. If this lord lacks anything, I will tell the emperor. There is no need to trouble imperial concubine Nyang Nyang. The ridicule in Feng Maching's words was very obvious. It was as if he was mocking the imperial concubine. He could see the emperor every day. Why would he need to tell her what he lacked? Xia Qing's expression suddenly turned ugly. She repeatedly told herself in her heart that this was a person of the pugilistic world. She couldn't lower herself to his level. Thinking of this, she felt a little better. Chapter 2141. Tower Master Feng is right, this consort spoke too much. Xia Qing said with a smile, this consort didn't know that Tower Master Feng and His Majesty are just benefactors. Why does this consort feel that His Majesty treats Tower Master Feng so differently? He. Feng Maching smiled coldly and said, Imperial consort, why don't you ask His Majesty yourself? Tower Master Feng, don't misunderstand. This consort just wants to know more about His Majesty. I heard that His Majesty likes to come to Tower Master Feng's place. Xia Qing smiled gently and said, I haven't seen His Majesty being so attentive to any concubine. Tower Master Feng, did you hear what His Majesty said? So that's what Imperial Consort wants to ask. Feng Maching had an understanding look. There was a faint smile in his eyes as he said, His Majesty likes to practice martial arts. If there's a concubine who can compete with His Majesty, I think His Majesty will definitely like to go. That's right, it must be the feeling of suppressing His Majesty. Feng Maching's pitch-black eyes flickered with a very playful expression. That ambiguous expression stunned the imperial consort. She frowned strangely. Hearing Feng Maching's words, was he looking for someone who could beat His Majesty? That was His Majesty. Even if she could beat His Majesty in martial arts, she wouldn't dare to use her full strength. Wasn't this making things difficult for her? Xia Qing looked at Feng Maching and felt that he wasn't joking. Xia Qing asked a few more questions, but they were all dismissed by Feng Maching's unfathomable words. However, from Feng Maching's words, she could tell that when Feng Maching and His Majesty interacted, there were no rules between them. Feng Maching sent Xia Qing, who was full of worries, away and stood leisurely in front of the courtyard door. Was he too close to Hellion Theo and attracted attention? Since the imperial consort was here, it meant that almost everyone knew. It seemed a little troublesome. Especially since Hellion Theo didn't even go to the concubine's place. If any rumors were to spread, someone come. Feng Maching thought for a moment and suddenly changed his order. Tower Master. A black shadow flashed out. Recently, if there are any killing jobs, take them all. This Tower Lord hasn't exercised for a long time. I'll go out and kill some people. Feng Maching curved his eyebrows and smiled. His words immediately caused the black-clothed man to widen his eyes. Tower Master, you're going to do it yourself? The black-clothed guard asked in astonishment. Can't I? Feng Maching turned his head and asked calmly. Although he looked calm, his eyes were filled with coldness. This subordinate doesn't dare. The man in black quickly lowered his head and said, this subordinate will do it right away. Feng Maching's heart Feng Maching looked at. Seeing Hellion Theo's Machings, Feng Maching's his looked when he saw Hellion Theo's his seeing Theo's as that's right STSS, Xia Qing came to see you? What did you talk about? Hellion Theo asked directly. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo's expression and laughed. Why? Are you afraid that I'll bully your concubine? Feng Maching asked with a faint smile. No. Hellion Theo lowered his head silently. He felt a little uncomfortable being stared at by Feng Maching. Don't worry, she doesn't know anything. I didn't say anything either. Feng Maching narrowed his eyes and replied. Chapter 2142. During this period of time, your concubine is about to give birth. You should move around more, don't let people gossip. Feng Maching raised his eyebrows casually. Hellion Theo was stunned when he heard Feng Maching's words, as if he found it strange. However, when he turned his head and saw that Feng Maching's expression didn't change, he silently pursed his lips and agreed. After that, Hellion Theo went to Xia Qing's palace frequently, but he never stayed overnight. His cold and indifferent expression didn't change, but it also seemed like something had changed. Xia Qing felt a little strange, and the emperor didn't say much. Only when Xia Qing asked about Feng Maching would Hellion Theo say a few more words. Your Majesty's relationship with Tower Lord Feng is really good, Xia Qing said as if she didn't care. Hellion Theo's eyes darkened slightly when he heard this. Why do you say that? Hellion Theo calmly raised the teacup in his hand and asked calmly. It's obvious from the way your Majesty and Tower Lord Feng are protecting each other. People who don't know would think that your Majesty cares about Tower Lord Feng, Xia Qing said. Hellion Theo's hand that was holding the teacup suddenly tightened. You can't speak carelessly. Hellion Theo stood up with a cold expression. Your Majesty, please forgive me. This concubine only feels that your Majesty cares about Tower Lord Feng more than this concubine. This concubine is pregnant with your Majesty's child. Xia Qing said with a little grievance, but she didn't see Hellion Theo's completely cold expression. Imperial concubine, is it because I'm too good to you? Hellion Theo turned and left after saying this, leaving Xia Qing bent over, her eyes filled with surprise. Imperial concubine. How can you say such things to the emperor? The palace maid beside her was also worried for Xia Qing. When she saw that Hellion Xiu had left, she said anxiously, Don't worry, Xia Qing. What's wrong with this concubine? Xia Qing frowned and said, I am the imperial concubine. How can the emperor always run to a man's courtyard? That may be the case, but... The palace maid pursed her lips tightly as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say anything. The imperial consort's actions today had clearly angered the emperor. All right, you may leave. This consort is tired. Xia Qing closed her eyes quietly. She was an imperial concubine and was pregnant with a dragon seed. Hellion Theo would definitely not do anything to her. After Hellion Theo came out of Xia Qing's palace, he turned around and went to the place where he usually checked the memorials. Looking at the memorials in his hand, a deep look appeared in his eyes. After a long silence, he still headed towards Feng Maching's residence. Not here. When Hellion Theo arrived, he was told that Feng Maching was not in the palace. Yes, the tower master received a mission and went out. The secret guard on duty said respectfully. Hellion Theo was silent for a moment, then turned and left. He was a little puzzled in his heart. Why did Feng Maching accept a mission? For half a month, Hellion Theo didn't even see Feng Maching's face. When he bumped into him by chance, Feng Maching had just returned from a mission and was very tired and had already fallen asleep. Hellion Theo didn't wake him up in the end. This kind of life continued until Xia Qing gave birth. In the palace, in Hellion Theo's bedroom, a midwife was brought to Hellion Theo. Hellion Theo was still wearing his dragon robe, exuding a noble aura. Chapter 2143. This old servant greets your majesty. When the midwife saw Hellion Theo, she bowed respectfully. Are you the midwife in charge of the imperial consort's delivery? Hellion Theo turned around and looked at the midwife with a deep look in his eyes. His gaze made the midwife feel very uneasy. She lowered her head and carefully responded. I don't care what method you use for this delivery. I want the prince to be safe. Hellion Theo stared at the midwife with his pitch-black eyes and said, if anything happens to the prince, I will have your head. Rest assured, your majesty. This old servant will definitely ensure the safety of the mother and child. The midwife responded respectfully. Didn't I just say that I only want the prince to be safe? Do you understand? Hellion Theo repeated himself. When the midwife heard Hellion Theo's words, she was clearly stunned. Then, as if she thought of something, she instantly broke out in a cold sweat. She trembled and knelt on the ground. She forced herself to calm down and said, rest assured, your majesty. This old servant will definitely ensure the prince's safety. Very good. Hellion Theo coldly turned around and said, I heard that you have a grandson. Bring him into the palace tomorrow. This old servant obeys. The midwife's face instantly turned pale. Her lips trembled and she respectfully kowtowed. When she left the room, she realized that her palms were covered in sweat. When the midwife walked away, she turned around to look at the palace she had just been in. She gripped her sleeves tightly, lowered her eyes, and turned around to leave without any expression. It had only been 3 to 5 days, and the imperial concubine was about to give birth. There were people coming and going in the palace. When Hellion Theo heard the news, he also came over. When he heard the screams in the room, his face sank. The child had been born for a long time, but there was still no news. Finally, after 6 hours, the midwife rushed out and said in a panic, Your Majesty, I'm afraid the imperial concubine won't be able to hold on. Save the child. Hellion Theo's face was cold. When he heard these words, there was no change in his expression. The concubines and palace maids waiting outside did not dare to breathe loudly. When they heard Hellion Theo's words, they were stunned. Suddenly, he felt a sense of sadness in his heart. This was the imperial family. Who would care about the life and death of a concubine? At this moment, the one who was protected was the prince. The midwife's trembling body went in again. In the delivery room, Xia Qing's eyes were full of horror. She had tried her best to give birth to the child, but before she could even take a look at the child, she saw the midwife step forward and grab her hand. What are you doing? Xia Qing's eyes were filled with fear. Imperial concubine Yang, this old servant is also a servant. The midwife looked at Xia Qing and pursed her lips tightly. It's your fault. You said something you shouldn't have said. The prince is safe and sound. The emperor said he would bury you well. What? Xia Qing's eyes were full of horror. She struggled in disbelief, but the midwife came up and covered her mouth and nose with a piece of cloth. Ugh! Ugh! Xia Qing struggled with her eyes wide open, but she had almost exhausted all her strength during the delivery. How could she escape? She suffocated deeply. Her eyes were full of unwillingness, and finally, she lost all her vitality. Chapter 2144. When the other three people in the room saw this scene, they couldn't help but turn their heads away. However, since this was the emperor's order, they didn't dare to say anything. The midwife looked at Xia Qing's lifeless body with a trace of pity in her eyes. At this moment, she deeply felt that the emperor was heartless. The child had just been born, but the child's mother was killed by the father. How sad this was. The midwife was silent for a moment. Then, she gathered her emotions and walked out with the child in her arms. Your Majesty, Imperial Consort. The midwife knelt on the ground with a sorrowful face. When the crowd heard the midwife's words, their faces suddenly changed. Hellion Theo slowly stood up. There was a different look in his eyes. He slowly lowered his head and looked at the prince who was in front of him. Bury him as an imperial consort. Place the child in the side hall of my palace. I will raise him personally. Hellion Theo looked at the child in silence. Then, he looked at the concubines outside and left expressionlessly. From the beginning to the end, Hellion Theo didn't go in to see Xia Qing. What a cold-blooded and heartless emperor. After this incident, Hellion Theo's cold-blooded name spread. Xia Qing was favored and gave birth to a prince. In the end, she died a heroic death. The funeral was very grand. The northern pastoral prince was born. He was the first and last prince. From then on, Hellion Shou never stepped into the imperial harem again. Some people said that Hellion Shou was cold-blooded and heartless. Some people said that Hellion Shou loved the imperial concubine deeply. In his heart, he missed the imperial concubine and was unwilling to be close to other imperial concubines. Especially when the crowd saw how Hellion Theo cared so much about the child, they felt that Hellion Theo still had feelings for the imperial consort. No matter what the outside world said, Hellion Theo never stood out to express his opinion. A month after the child was born, Hellion Theo immediately issued an imperial edict when the prince was 1 month old and crowned the child as the crown prince. There were voices all over the court, but Hellion Shou was so strong that he did not back down at all. You're back. After Hellion Theo returned, he saw Feng Maching standing by the child's bed. He was slightly stunned. In the end, he said quietly. When Feng Maching heard Hellion Theo's voice, he turned to look. Yes, Feng Maching replied calmly. I didn't expect you to be so cruel. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo and said with a faint smile, why didn't you keep Xia Qing? Nothing. Hellion Theo obviously didn't want to talk about this matter. He pursed his lips and said, where did you go? Why did you take so long to come back? What? Did you miss me? Feng Maching reached out and hugged Hellion Theo. The way he leaned close to Hellion Theo instantly made Hellion Theo stiffen. He turned to look at the child on the bed and found that the child on the bed was staring at Feng Maching and Hellion Theo with a pair of pitch-black eyes. Stop fooling around. Hellion Theo broke free from Feng Maching's hand. Feng Maching looked at Hellion Theo's red face and a faint smile appeared in his eyes. The two men lying on the bed in the room played with the child curiously. They held the child in their arms and had the same thought in their minds. Why did it feel like such a small child would die with a casual squeeze? Chapter 2145. Their eyes were filled with smiles. The light that shone in from outside the window shone on the two of them. It was so dazzling. What are your plans for the future? Feng Maching stood by the corridor of the northern pastoral. Behind him was a group of palace maids and eunuchs. Feng Maching looked at the scenery of the northern pastoral and narrowed his eyes slightly. He turned his head to look at Hellion Theo beside him and asked, "What about you? What are your plans?" Hellion Theo did not answer. Instead, he turned his head to look at Feng Maching and asked. Feng Maching fell silent. "Feng Maching, raise the child with me," Hellion Theo suddenly said. When Feng Maching heard Hellion Theo's words, the expression on his face suddenly became a little strange. He frowned tightly as if he was conflicted about something. He looked at Hellion Theo and asked, "Then, when this child grows up, will he call me father or mother?" "You're not serious." Hellion Theo's cheeks immediately turned red when he heard this. Under the setting sun, the two of them stood side by side and their bodies were stretched very long. Feng Maching looked at the exquisite scenery in the distance with a calm expression in his eyes. This was the northern pastoral, where Hellion Theo lived. It was enough. "Feng Maching, come and change the diaper." Hellion Theo was about to go crazy. This is what the child's mother wants to do. Feng Maching drank leisurely at the side. "I'm going to kill you." In the room, Hellion Theo wanted to personally change the child's diaper. It was as if he wanted to tear the roof off the house. Feng Maching could not stand it anymore. When he walked over to help, the more he tried to help, the more trouble he caused. The two men struggled for a long time before they finally changed the child's diaper. Fortunately, the child was obedient today. If he was not obedient, he would probably cry and scream. It was tiring to have such parents. After that, the things that happened were endless. Feed, change, put to bed, and so on. This made Hellion Theo and Feng Maching realize how difficult it was to raise a child. They decisively threw the child to the wet nurse. Muda was sweating silently for his emperor. When Hellion Theo said that he wanted to take care of the children himself, Muda's heart was filled with worry. Now it seemed that his worry was right. Fortunately, the emperor still had self-awareness. Couldn't he just be a proper emperor? Eunuch Mu, why do you think the emperor is so close to brothel Lord Feng? As time passed, the news about Hellion Theo and Feng Maching gradually spread. However, this was the emperor's business. In the end, no one dared to spread it too much. A few ministers reported this matter, but they were scolded by Hellion Theo. Those who dared to insult Feng Maching were directly removed from their positions. A few years later, rumors began to circulate in the palace of the northern shepherds. It was as if the relationship between Hellion Xiao and Feng Maching had become a secret that everyone knew about, but no one dared to speak of. It was also a heavy stroke in the historical records. From then on, the emperor of the northern pastoral did not have any favored concubines. The position of the empress of the northern pastoral was empty. When Hellion Theo was 13 years old, Hellion Theo became the emperor's assistant. Bit by bit, he handed over the power in his hands to his son. When Hellion Yu was 18 years old, Hellion Theo announced his abdication. When Hellion Yu inherited the throne, Hellion Theo disappeared without a trace. In the beginning, there were people who asked about the late emperor. Later, there was no news at all. No one even knew if he was alive or dead. The northern pastoral was completely handed over to Hellion Yu. Feng Maching and Hellion Theo, it's over. Chapter 2146. As time passed, all living things changed with time. The king of Tokyo became the overlord of the world, ruling over the 4 seas and 8 directions. After a few years of stability, it seemed to have loosened a little. It had been nearly 8 years since Xiao Chen and Jing Yu returned from Miaojiang. The imperial city of Tokyo was still bustling as before. The majesty of the magnificent gate of Prince Qingping's residence did not allow anyone to violate it. The departure of the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine did not cause the prince's residence to be defeated. In fact, the prince's residence was even more high-profile than when Xiao Chen was still alive. Prince Qingping, Xiao Bai, was now above tens of thousands of people and below one person. He was extraordinarily noble. Tomorrow is the Qiqiao festival. I heard that Prince Qingping is going to choose a consort. The weather in July was hot. Now, the streets and alleys were talking about Prince Qingping's consort. The men were curious, and the women were blushing. Prince Qingping, Xiao Bai, had great power and wealth. He had no concubines or women in his residence. Most importantly, Prince Qingping was handsome. He was simply the first choice for a husband. Moreover, Prince Qingping was the adopted son of the 9th emperors and the 9th imperial concubine. In the general's residence, the empress was incomparably close to Prince Qingping. Who didn't want to marry into the prince's residence? From then on, they could rest easy and live a life of luxury. However, Prince Qingping still had no intention of marrying a consort. Finally, this rumor was leaked this year. Immediately, all the women in the imperial capital who met the requirements boiled over. The Qiqiao festival was the place for the consort selection on the Ling Long boat. Although there was no clear notice, everyone seemed to think that they must make a good impression in front of Prince Qingping on the Ling Long boat. "Young lady, your noodles are here." A voice pulled the woman's thoughts back. It was a woman in plain clothes. There was a long sword on the table. Looking at her appearance, she seemed to be a person of Jianghu. In the Tokyo Imperial City, this waiter had seen many people of Jianghu. After placing the noodles in front of the woman, he turned and left. The noodles in the Imperial City are still so disgusting. The woman lifted her large cloak and veiled hat. After taking a bite, she put down her chopsticks in disgust. She turned her head slightly and saw an exquisite restaurant diagonally across the street. It was a majestic restaurant with the words "Come if you have money" written on it. It was said that this restaurant had been taken away by him. No wonder he had so much wealth. The woman lowered her head indifferently. She took out some money and put it down before she got up and left. She walked a few streets based on her memory before she stood in front of a mansion. She raised her head and looked at the plaque above the mansion, General's Mansion. "Please pass on the message that Feng Yu is here to pay a visit to the general's wife." As she spoke, she lifted her veil, revealing her country-toppling beauty hidden under it. She seemed to have the charm of a foreign land, and her pitch-black eyes were so bright and moving. "Feng Yu." Just as Feng Yu finished speaking, she heard a voice call out to her from behind. That steady voice caused Feng Yu to be slightly stunned. She turned around and saw the man who had just dismounted from his horse. He was dressed in black as usual. Big brother Xing. Feng Yu looked at the man with a faint stubble. Her eyebrows slowly curved as she politely called out to him. "It really is you." Second interrogation officer was clearly a little surprised as well. He looked Feng Yu up and down. That young and tender girl from back then had now grown into a slender and elegant woman. Her arched brows vaguely reminded him of her childhood. Chapter 2147. Why did you come to the Imperial City? Why didn't you tell me in advance? Xing Er's face was filled with joy as he said, "Come in quickly." Feng Yu smiled faintly. Her current appearance could not be associated with the willful little witch from before. Xing Er said something to the guards and led Feng Yu into the residence. "Daddy." Just as Feng Yu stepped in, she saw a little girl around 6 or 7 years old pouncing on Xing Er and hanging onto Xing Er's body. "June, you're already so big. Come down quickly." Xing Er's eyes were filled with helplessness. Who's this big sister?" The little girl hugging Xing Er was lying on Xing Er's shoulder. When she saw Feng Yu following behind Xing Er, she blinked her eyes in surprise. Her eyes were filled with amazement. "Oh! I know! It's the little wife that Daddy brought back." The little girl looked as if she had been discovered. She quickly jumped off Xing Er's body and said loudly, "I'm going to tell Mommy that Daddy cheated on her." Xing Er and Feng Yu's faces were filled with black lines. "Xing Kejuan! Get over here for this old lady." Just as Feng Yu was about to explain, she suddenly heard an angry shout. It was a woman in riding attire who rushed over with a horsewhip in her hand. Aya! We have guests. When the woman in riding attire saw second Xing and Feng Yu, she hurriedly hid the horsewhip in her hand behind her back. The way she changed her expression in that split second was simply breathtaking. Madam. Xing Er looked at Shangguan Linglan's appearance and helplessly held his forehead. Shangguan Linglan's face was still the same. She didn't seem to have changed much after so many years, but upon closer inspection, she seemed to have gained a hint of charm. The way she stood quietly still made her look like a noble lady, but Feng Yu was immune to it after experiencing the roar just now. Look who's here. Second Xing's face was also full of helplessness as he looked at Shangguan Linglan and said. This is. Shangguan Linglan was slightly taken aback when he heard Feng Yu's words. Then, he looked at Feng Yu carefully. Mother, this is father's new wife. The little girl, Xing Kejuan, rolled her eyes and walked out in a loud voice. Little girl, if you keep talking nonsense, I'll seal your mouth. Shangguan Linglan scowled at her words, scaring Xing Kejuan so much that she hid behind Xing Er. She pouted and said, Mother is so fierce. General Shangguan's charm is still the same as before. When Feng Yu saw this scene, she immediately laughed in amusement. She bowed slightly to Shangguan Linglan and said. Shangguan Linglan hadn't heard this title for many years, so he was stunned for a long time. He looked at Feng Yu and suddenly seemed to have discovered something. He called out in surprise, You are Feng Yu. Feng Yu greets madam. Feng Yu bowed slightly. It's really you. Aren't you in Miaojiang? Why did you suddenly come to the imperial city? Why didn't you tell me in advance? Please come in. Feng Yu's arrival made Shangguan Linglan surprised. This is my daughter, Xing Kejuan. Shangguan Linglan touched Xing Kejuan's head and said to Feng Yu. I know. Where's the young master? Feng Yu said with a slight smile, You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.